Perhaps the best example for the analysis of the present global crisis may be the historical struggle of the Republic of Argentina for its economic sovereignty and a social justice without relying on the international financier interests. The relationship between Argentina and the IMF is an illustrative case in this context. The International Monetary Fund was created on July 22, 1944, at the famous Bretton Woods Conference, which came into existence on December 27, 1945. This period marked the beginning of the tragic downturn for the world at large. Franklin D. Roosevelt was elected for the first time in 1932, not because of the war, since the United States then was maintaining its tradition of anti-imperialist, non-interventionist policies, but because of the Great Depression. He became the only American president in history who served 4 terms until his death on April 12, 1945, only 4 months before the end of the World War II. He was the single most important figure in order to realize the vision of the post-war period without colonialism anywhere in the world. The IMF, along with the newly founded United Nations, was seen as a useful tool to achieve this end. However, the untimely death of President Roosevelt left a vacuum in the world leadership through which the British Empire, represented by a pure imperialist Winston Churchill, successfully perverted the future vision of FDR into something that would serve its own sinister interests. The 2 nuclear bombs were dropped in the middle of the civilian centers in Hiroshima and Nagasaki by the Truman administration under the auspices of the British Empire, which paved the way for the opening of another world war that came to be known as the Cold War. Under this new imperial scheme, the institutions such as the IMF have lost the core of their identity to serve the humanity and to become absorbed in the British orchestrated Cold War structure of the world. In the meanwhile, the nation of Argentina was going through its own paradigm shift with the emergence of Juan Domingo Perón. Immensely popular among the laborers and the forgotten layers of the population, Perón was elected as the President of the Republic of Argentina on February 24, 1946, about 2 weeks prior to the so-called Iron Curtain speech given by Winston Churchill at Westminster College in Missouri, the home state of President Truman, in order to convince the United States to break from the legacy of Franklin Roosevelt on the question of the world without colonialism, and rather to join the British Empire's war on communist world.
From Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an iron curtain has descended across the continent. Behind that line...
Despite the artificial geopolitical division drawn by the British Empire between the capitalist and the communist regions of the world, Argentina under Perón squarely refused to play the same imperial game. For instance, he quickly nationalized the Central Bank of Argentina and paid off its billion-dollar debt to the Bank of England. This was not necessarily a surprising move, not simply because of his stated commitment to the economic sovereignty, but also because of the historical experience of Argentina with the colonial interventionist policies of the British Empire. The Panic of 1890, or the Bering Crisis, is the 19th century's most famous sovereign debt crisis caused by the near insolvency of Barings Bank in London due to excessive risk-taking on poor investments in Argentina. It barely averted the complete collapse of the entire private banking system of London and potentially the entire region of Europe through an international consortium assembled by the governor of the Bank of England, which included the Rothschilds and the most of the major London banks of the time. However, Argentina, along with the neighboring countries such as Brazil and Uruguay, was devastated by this massive collapse of international speculative bubble and was left with a permanent scar in the memory of all the Argentines. Aiming to achieve the economic sovereignty, Perón nationalized many of the key economic sectors of Argentina, such as the railways, which were mostly owned by British and French companies, universities, public utilities, public transport, and so on. Regarding the foreign policy, he adopted the concept la tercera posición, or the third position, in order to clarify the Argentine stance that it would not partake in either side of the Cold War division for the sake of their ideologies, a stance which became a precedent of the non-aligned movement. Argentina was headed toward its economic sovereignty without submitting to foreign financier interests, known commonly today as voucher funds. Argentina joined the IMF on September 20th, 1956, only after the bloody coup d'etat of 1955, through which Perón narrowly escaped the aerial bombings of the heart of Buenos Aires and was forced into exile in Spain. Since then, the entire nation has fallen into a state of disarray for the decades to follow, including a series of dictatorships which culminated in 1976, when the bloodiest regime in the Argentine history was established through a coup and ouster of the President Isabel Perón, wife of the deceased former President Juan Perón. Even after the restoration of democracy in 1983, the nation had to endure the period of neoliberalism through radical privatization policies, allowing an enormous influx of foreign investments and speculations, and the massive borrowing by the government from the international financial institutions such as IMF. The real recovery had to wait for the arrival of Nestor Kirchner and his wife and incumbent president, Cristina Fernandez.